a little introduction to you, Safiya. You were born in, I don't know if this pronunciation is right, Mulhouse.
That's the English pronunciation, yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mulhouse. Mm-hmm.
Mulhouse in Alsace in France. This is coincidentally nicknamed the French Manchester, a very diverse city. He studied foreign languages and business at a university in eastern France. You're married to Le Mans and is the mother of 4 teenagers. So that's, you've got your work cut out there. Having said that, you also work as a translator, a Pilates instructor, and a French tutor. You came to live in the UK 27 years ago. So that's very, very brief introduction to Safiya, who will now tell you her story of coming from France to the UK 27 years ago. Over to you, Safiya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Shalom aleichem, and peace and blessings upon you all. It's a real honor and a pleasure to take part in this evening, sharing our stories, and I feel very honored to have just come after these two quite eloquent speakers. And it's interesting, although I may not look it, but the previous speaker, Alex, and myself have got a lot in common. Listening to his story, I come from Alsace, which is very close to Germany. So we are cousins. And my background is quite mixed, actually. When preparing for tonight, I just reminisced on the story of my grandparents, and it's something that I was always a bit proud of, because it made me a bit different, I guess, from the rest of the young girls in Alsace. So, as Heather said, I was born and raised and lived 20 odd years in Mulhouse in Alsace, which is an industrial town, fairly big, which is nicknamed, I found out only much later, once I'd moved and settled in Manchester, that it was called the French Manchester because it has exactly the same industries, textile and coal mining. And incidentally, in the 19th century, mid-19th century, a lot of French Alsatian councillors from the town went to Manchester and Salford to study the way the houses had been built for the workers, because they wanted to emulate the same structures. So that's kind of added to my love of Manchester, and it explained as well maybe why I felt so much at home in this city. So I am one of 3 children, and my father is the son of an Italian father and Alsatian mother. But the interesting bit is that my great-grandparents, so paternal grandparents, moved from northern Italy on the other side of the Swiss border, crossed Switzerland and went to Alsace, which at the time in the late 1800s was in Prussia. They would have never moved to France because France was underdeveloped, poor, and there was a lot of unrest. It was sort of after the Napoleonic Empire. And so they went to Prussia in Alsace, who was very rich, and they set up a canteen for workers. And as Italian immigrants, they struggled quite a lot. So Alex's stories about being taken for an Italian resonated a lot with me, because these are the stories that I heard from my grandfather about what his parents were saying at the time. It really was not very popular to be Italian. They were really second-class citizens for the most. Whereas nowadays, you have so many people with Italian names that they just form part of society as if they'd always been there. But certainly 100 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, it wasn't very popular. So they did struggle a lot with racism, difficulty, but they made their way. And by the time, obviously, when I was born in the 70s, none of this existed anymore. My grandfather had managed to make quite a good life of himself. And was a well-established shop owner. So I don't really know much about the background of my great-grandfather, because he was an orphan, and this is why my last name is Ascoli, which is the name of a city in Italy, because orphans are given names of cities. And it's a very famous, I think, for people who know football, it's a famous Italian football header. You might want to look that one up. I just love the fact that there's like a bit of mystery in the background, and like this mixed blood. And researching my mother's side, we know that we come down from Protestant farmers who left Ireland in the medieval times. So I'm not entirely sure. I was told the 12th century, but I've not really found a lot of evidence yet when exactly that would have happened. Who were basically trying to flee from Protestant. They were oppressed as being Protestant in a mainly Catholic country. So I would have been in the 15th century, but anyway, that's a detail. Again, that was kind of another side. So it feels like I'm like at the central point of probably some German blood from my maternal grandfather, some Irish blood from the mother's side, some Italian blood from that, and it's just makes this all makes it a bit of a explosive cocktail, I guess, when it comes to my personality. But that kind of gave me this desire constantly to discover new worlds, to travel. Had a very early on love for languages, tried to speak a bit of Italian with my dad, etc. So it was very natural for me to study languages. And when you study languages, a natural thing to do is to try and spend some time in the language to study. So I studied English and Spanish, and I went to live in Ireland for a year, which was an amazing experience. It was the 1990s, very different to now, I think. Really an eye-opener even in terms of spirituality. Very, very natural, very connected with nature, with the deep, real stuff, which I found was refreshing to my life, which I found maybe a little bit vain and not easy, but like, yeah, I was looking for deeper meaning in life, and Ireland really certainly started to provide that. But in the 80s, already from in my teenagers years, the place to be if you were French was London. And I know that I live in England, London, the place to be for the Brits is to go to Paris. But for me, Paris was just a little bit, well, yeah, it's just, I know it's just France, but London was just so attractive. The punk culture, there's just that attitude of you could see a guy with a bowler hat and in the tube next to a punk, and there's something absolutely alien to French mentality and culture, which is quite conformist actually. And I went to London as much as I could after that, and when I finished my studies, decided to just take the train, and incidentally one of the first Eurostar trains, crossed the channel and went to live in London and found a work in public relations. And it was really easy. So when Heather asked me if I could speak about my migrant story, I thought, it's not like I don't want to be associated with being a migrant, but it's just I never considered myself, because it was so easy to move. It was as if I had gone to another French city, just we were speaking another language. But it was that easy. Just packed my bags, took my passport, but at the time, ID, official ID was enough. You didn't need passports. Things have changed a lot with Brexit. It's a totally different kettle of fish now. Now, the French who want to come to Britain, like the rest of Europe, they definitely have to prove their mettle, and they have to prove that they can live and work here, and they have, it's a proper migrant. But I still, in a sense, consider myself a little bit like an economic migrant, because I really wanted a different life for myself. There were not a huge amount of opportunities in my hometown. And because I've studied languages, it made more sense for me to go abroad, because as a French person, I would find probably better jobs than if I'd stayed in France with a bit of English, speaking a bit of English. And I was right. So I settled down very quickly. But the interesting bit about going to London is that, first of all, I was going to London, not England, not Britain, it was London or nothing. And London has this sort of position where it's a bit like a bubble, where you're a bit isolated from the rest of Britain. And I understand it even more now that I live in Manchester. And it's already in the 90s, very, very multicultural. And I worked in a company that had a lot of young people from all over the world because of the nature of the work. But most of my friends were foreigners. There were Spaniards, there were Scandinavians, Germans, Colombians, you name it. But they were not Brits, they were not English. And I found that the English were very reserved, very, I would say even not very sociable, apart from if you went to the pub. But there was no, you were not invited into each other's homes for dinner parties, which is the thing that we would do in France. Once you start talking a little bit and getting acquainted, a colleague, sometimes you would invite your boss. But that's not a done thing in England at all. So it was very hard to make friends. I really struggled with that because I just love making friends, discovered the culture, and I found it, there was something lacking. So it was not really a British life I was living, but more a foreigner's life in London. And that completely changed when I got married, because I married my husband, who's an Englishman, whose family has been in England for forever. And I then discovered a kind of English life, and this just became more part of a family, and that helped really helped me develop my roots. Obviously, when then we started having children, that's it. You know, when you start having children and settle down somewhere, and your children consider that place to be their home, that's it. That's your home, I think, personally, because that's where they want to live all their lives. And that most of the time, this is where they will then settle. So I have now kind of distanced myself a little bit, separated myself a little bit with France for that. Still go and visit, but I do not really consider, for practical reasons, to move back to France. Now it's become even more because of my faith that I've chosen, because of the fact that I wear a scarf, because of the political situation in France, the controlling behavior of the government. I have now absolutely decided consciously I will not go back to France, but that now is more of a stance rather than just, it's not really practical for me to live in France. And this is why, again, I connect a lot with what our previous speaker just said. I find the British so welcoming, so non-judgmental. You have individuals who will be judgmental. You have individuals who will be racist, who will be bigoted. But overall, the general population, the general interactions you have with people. I'll give you an example. I just moved to Manchester very briefly, and a taxi driver picked me up, and I was going to the BBC to give a talk about, give an interview about the scarf. And it was at the time of the height of the, several years ago, 10, 15 years ago. And he asked me what I was doing. I told him, and he said, "Oh, poor you, can't they just leave you alone in France about your scarf?" That was just such a shock to hear this, compared to what I would have had in France by a taxi driver who would have abused me because I was wearing the scarf. So it was kind of just proving that I definitely had made the right choice. And I just really do not really want to move. And Manchester is really my hometown now. So I was naturalized British 18 years ago. I do not have a French passport, and I would only reluctantly do it, renew it if, and for my children do them, if it meant that it would make things really easier, much easier for me to go to France, visit my family. But I do not have a great desire to be much more connected to France now anymore.